Hillary Clinton said Colin Powell advised her to use private email account. Pressed by the FBI about her email practices at the State Department, Hillary Clinton told investigators that former Secretary of State Colin L. Powell had advised her to use a personal email account. The account is included in the notes the Federal Bureau of Investigation handed over to Congress on Tuesday, relaying in detail the 3.5-hour interview with Mrs. Clinton in early July that led to the decision by James B. Comey, the Bureau's director, not to pursue criminal charges against her. The account is included in the notes the Federal Bureau of Investigation handed over to Congress on Tuesday, relaying in detail the 3.5-hour interview with Mrs. Clinton in early July that led to the decision by James B. Comey, the Bureau's director, not to pursue criminal charges against her. Separately, in a 2009 email exchange that also emerged during the FBI questioning, Mrs. Clinton, who had already decided to use private email, asked Mr. Powell about his email practices when he was the nation's top diplomat under George W. Bush, according to a person with direct knowledge of Mr. Powell's appearance in the documents, who would not speak for attribution. Mrs. Clinton and her campaign have repeatedly pointed to the use of personal email by Mr. Powell and other government officials to try and explain the email controversy to voters. But Mrs. Clinton has not said publicly that Mr. Powell personally recommended that she rely on a private account. The journalist Joe Conason first reported the conversation between Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Powell in his coming book about Bill Clinton's post-presidency, Man of the World: The Further Endeavors of Bill Clinton, which the Times received an advanced copy of. Mr. Conason describes the conversation in the early months of Mrs. Clinton's tenure at the State Department at a small dinner party hosted by Madeleine Albright, another former Secretary of State, at her home in Washington. Henry Kissinger and Condoleezza Rice also attended. Toward the end of the evening, over dessert, Albright asked all of the former secretaries to offer one salient bit of counsel to the nation's next top diplomat, Mr. Conason writes. Powell told her to use her own email, as he had done, except for classified communications, which he had sent and received via a State Department computer. Mr. Conason continued, saying that his use of personal email had been transformative for the department. Mr. Powell thus confirmed a decision she had made months earlier, to keep her personal account and use it for most messages. A longtime defender of the Clintons, Mr. Conason interviewed both Mr. and Mrs. Clinton for the book, a granular account of the years since Mr. Clinton left office that will be published on September 13. Mrs. Clinton and her campaign have repeatedly pointed to the use of personal email by Mr. Powell and other government officials to try and explain the email controversy to voters, but Mrs. Clinton has not said publicly that Mr. Powell personally recommended that she rely on a private account. Mr. Powell's office released a statement on Thursday night saying he had no recollection of the dinner conversation. He did write Mrs. Clinton an email memo, which may exist in the FBI files, describing his use of his personal email account for unclassified messages and how it vastly improved communications within the State Department, the statement said. In his memoir, It Worked for Me, Mr. Powell writes about his personal email, and he has taken pride in having tried to advance the antiquated technology practices at the State Department. But his use of personal email and Mrs. Clinton's aren't entirely parallel. Mr. Powell did not have a server at his house or rely on outside contractors, as Mrs. Clinton did at her home in Chappaqua, New York. A State Department Inspector General report released in May said that Mr. Powell and other senior officials had used personal email accounts for official business, but that by the time Mrs. Clinton took office the rules were clear that using a private server in such a manner was neither allowed nor encouraged because of significant security risks. In Mrs. Clinton's case, the practice has created particular controversy because of her family's foundation and its donors who had varying political and business interests while Mrs. Clinton was Secretary of State. On Thursday, the Clinton Foundation confirmed that it would no longer accept foreign or corporate funds should Mrs. Clinton win in November. Although he did not recommend criminal charges, Mr. Comey said in July that Mrs. Clinton's exclusive reliance on a private email address and server had been extremely careless. The State Department has asked to review the notes from Mrs. Clinton's session with the FBI before they are released, in case they include sensitive information. Clinton aides have expressed concerns that in the meantime congressional Republicans will try to leak parts of the materials to hurt Mrs. Clinton's campaign. "We believe that if these materials are going to be shared outside the Justice Department," said Brian Fallon, a spokesman for the campaign, "they should be released widely so that the public can see them for themselves."